My name is General George Rapine Smith. I was born in 1804 in Virginia, and I left this earthly plane in 1879. That's me in the good old days, the early days of Sedalia. Well, you could say the earliest days of Sedalia. You see, I founded this great city. I came from Kentucky in 1833 and settled in Georgetown. By the early 1850s, the Pacific Railroad was building west out of St. Louis, and I thought that maybe one of the best things for prosperity for this area would be a brand new railroad, and I might have the chance to make a little money myself, perhaps even a fortune. The first thing we had to do was convince a railroad to build across the prairie out of Jefferson City instead of taking the preferred route through the Missouri River Valley. Well, I worked tirelessly to raise the money to get the railroad to come through Pettis County, and I was successful. But then the surveyors went and laid it out 3 miles south of Georgetown. Well, my neighbors in Georgetown weren't very impressed with the railroad or its opportunities. Absalom McVeigh gave some land to the railroad. Now, Absalom was a good friend of mine and one of Pettis County's earliest pioneers. Fact is, Absalom had 24 children by 3 wives. Well, in 1856, I purchased 503 acres of land from Absalom for $13 an acre. It straddled the survey line, and it became downtown Sedalia. Well, when the railroad decided to build straight out of Smithton and right through our property, it became a bonanza for us and for this great city of Sedalia. What a journey it has been. Come along and share this journey, 150 years of the Sedalia Adventure. Along the way, you'll meet some fine Sedalians who will share their memories of this wonderful town, the Queen City of the Prairies. I filed the city plat on October 16, 1860. This is officially the beginning of Sedalia. I named the city after one of my 2 daughters, Sarah. That's her on the right. Her nickname was Sed, and I called the town Sedville. I'd already named a riverboat after her sister Martha, so I had to name something after Sarah. Well, some friends said Sedville was not a proper name for a city, and they suggested we call it Sedalia. Well, the boat sank a long time ago, but Sedalia is still going strong. This is my wife, Melita. She remembers what Sedalia was like at the very first.
The land my husband George bought was mostly barren ground. There was hardly a tree in sight. The prairie grass was as tall as a man's boot on horseback. The land was dotted with stands of colorful prairie wildflowers. I must say that people jeered at my husband and called him crazy for trying to start a new town here. But all that began to change when the Pacific Railroad, that later became known as the Missouri Pacific, arrived here in Sedalia on January the 17th, 1861. Our town wasn't much to begin with, just a few frame houses, mostly north of the new railroad tracks. George built one of the first houses in Sedalia at 7th and Washington. That house was moved several times, and much later it became Melita Day Nursery. Our house survived for over 100 years before it was torn down. There were no shade and there were no sidewalks in the beginning. There were a few wooden buildings scattered along a block or 2 of Main Street, but they seemed to burn down every time you turned around. One early settler wrote about Sedalia, fleas and flies, cows, hogs, and dogs. They seemed to be in possession of the town.
Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration. We liked our town. We had barely got started before the Civil War broke out. And then barely a year after I founded Sedalia, my beautiful wife, Melita, passed on. and I never remarried. But I did build a beautiful house at Massachusetts and Broadway, where I lived with my daughters until my own passing in 1879. I'm standing here in what has become Crown Hill Cemetery. Now, this high ground played an important part in Sedalia's biggest skirmish of the Civil War. Sedalia and the area around Sedalia was split about half and half between Confederate and Union sympathizers. Now, Sedalia itself was under martial law and run by a Union garrison. But the local Home Guard was vastly outnumbered in 1864 when the Southern generals Joe Shelby and Sterling Price came through Missouri on their way to Westport. They burned bridges and they tore down the telegraph lines all their way to Sedalia. On October 14, 1864, the Confederates, numbering about 1,500 troops, set up 3 cannons on this high ground and shelled our little town of Sedalia. The Union garrison in Sedalia surrendered by early afternoon. The Confederate troops, under the command of General Jeff Thompson and Sedalia native Major James Wood, burned several businesses and loaded everything they could and headed off to Westport. The Civil War shut down all growth and building for a few years, just as the railroad got to Sedalia. The town was supposed to become the trailhead for the big cattle drives out of the Southwest. It's the stuff of legend. Thousands of cattle, hundreds of tired, dusty cowboys pouring into Sedalia. Wild West days and nights. But legend is the key word here. Now, John Wayne headed to Sedalia with his Texas cattle in the 1948 movie Red River. Sedalia was also the destination for the cattle drives of Rawhide, a popular CBS TV show in the late 1950s. But that was mostly entertainment make-believe. Historians today say Sedalia's role in the cattle drives was greatly exaggerated. It didn't really happen that way because of territorial animosities, fear of Texas fever, and irate southern Missouri farmers prevented the cattle from coming through Missouri. Oh, we shipped a lot of cattle from Sedalia. The railroads had large stockyards by their tracks, and for years locally raised cattle were loaded onto rail cars here and sent to slaughter and packing houses. But the legend continued to thrive, and in 1959, the Rawhide TV stars Eric Fleming and a very young and then unknown actor named Clint Eastwood came to Sedalia to promote the show. I understand that Eastwood fella went on to a pretty good career. Now, during the Civil War, the railroads kept building west to Kansas City and then to further points westward in Kansas. Abilene, Wichita, and Dodge City became the new railheads for the cattle drives of history rather than Sedalia.